In this lecture, we will be looking at Gothic Europe north of the Alps, chapter 13. And what we're going to be focusing on is we're looking at the 12th, 13th, and 14th century. Now, just like last time when we talked about the term Romanesque, how it was not used by the people of the time, the same is true of the term Gothic. It again was not used by the people of the time, and actually it was originally a negative reflection of the works. The art historian Giorgio Vasari claimed Gothic art was both monstrous and barbarous. The idea was also, these was from the people in the Renaissance, the idea was that nothing of importance or of value really happened in the Middle Ages, including the Gothic. The late medieval and Gothic are now looked at as one of the high points in Western art. The achievements of the Gothic era were made available by the widespread prosperity and favorable climate in Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries. The focus was of both the religious and intellectual life, and this shifted from the monasteries in the countries to the rising and the developing cities. Paris became the intellectual as well as the artistic center of the Gothic world. The papacy also was at its height of its power during this time, and the Crusades were continuing, but the independent nation-states of modern Europe were beginning to take shape. Like the Romanesque, there are regional differences, but this chapter is only going to explore France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. So we'll begin with the birth of Gothic in France, and we'll start with our exploration by looking at Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis was a few miles north of Paris, and Saint-Denis was the official church of the French monarchy and the burial place of Saint Dionysius. Abbot Suger became abbot in 1122, and in 1135 he began a major campaign to rebuild the church. The new west facade was first, and then the east end was started in 1140. June 11th, 1144 was the dedication of the new choir abbey church of Saint-Denis. The dedication was carried out by Abbot Suger, and King Louis VII of France, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, and 5 archbishops were part of those who were attending. Architectural historians pinpoint this as the birth of the style that later came to be known as Gothic, and Abbot Suger as its founding spirit. You do see some influence from Norman Romanesque churches, especially in the early 12th century churches of Burgundy, the pilgrimage churches that we looked at last time, but we also are going to see some very drastic changes. Most of the essential elements of what is known as the Gothic style were present at Saint-Denis. The west facade welcomes worshipers into the church, and it has this new design. You can see it in the image here. There's a large round window, or what's known as a rose window, over the central portal. The wall facades were broken up with large number of voids, creating a lighter effect. Also, figural sculpture adorned all 3 portals, and narrative reliefs decorated the 3 tympanion. And then the most innovative change is the introduction of figures attached to the columns in the jambs. This was the first step towards the revival of freestanding statuary in the later Middle Ages. And then the east end, what we're going to see is lightweight vaults come from slender columns in the ambulatory and radiating chapels. This replaced the thick walls of the Romanesque chapels. One of the essential elements of Gothic architecture would be the rib vaults that rest on pointed arches, and you can see them in these images here. The outer walls were opened up again with colossal glass windows. You can see them from the interior here. And this transformed the natural light into the divine light, or what Suger called the colored light, the lux nova, or the new light. So Gothic churches were admired and emulated throughout Europe as stone and glass images of the city of God. And we're going to spend some time looking at several of them from France. The next we're going to look at is Chartres. Here the west facade began around 1145, and it does retain the fortress-like look of many Romanesque churches, but it also features the large rose window and a great number of openings. It has an extensive figural sculpture program in its triple entrance, which we'll look at in more detail here. And these sculptures at Chartres constitutes the most complete surviving ensemble of early Gothic sculptures. Now, it's known as the Royal Portal because of the figures of the Old Testament kings and queens flanking the doorway. You can see those on the right here. Now, they wear 12th century garments, so observers may think of them as the kings and queen of France. The figures are rigidly upright with elbows close tucked into their bodies, and the elongated proportions mirror the vertical lines of the shafts they are on. They are literally attached to the columns. Technically, they are high reliefs, but again, they are part of the columns. They are attached to them. And we also see in these works a new interest in naturalism. The heads and faces have expressions, and this started an era of artistic concern with personality and individuality, and we're going to see this develop more and more of the works. Now, the archivolt of the right portal depicts the 7 female personifications of the liberal arts, and below them were learned men of antiquity at their feet. And this celebrates the revival of classical scholarship in the 12th century and symbolizes human knowledge. Now, this is not really a move away from the church because there was the belief that human knowledge led to true faith. Also interesting is the 3 doorways are all united by carved episodes from the lives of the Virgin and Christ on the capitals. So if you look from left to right, you can see the capitals right at the top of the doorways. And what happens is they go all the way across. And so basically what this does is it creates a kind of frieze linking one entrance to the next. And there are many other elements. Your textbook goes into a lot of detail, but these are just a few. And then again, this chapter has a lot of those sidebars, so make sure you're reading them. But what's also interesting is during the Gothic period is the role of the Virgin Mary. Mary assumes a more central role in the Gothic period, and we're going to see her represented more. The Virgin became the spiritual lady of chivalry, and the Christian knight dedicated his life to her. But what we're also going to see, we've seen Mary depicted many times before, but in Gothic art, she's going to be made more human, more loving. And so this kindly, she's not just the mother of God, but she's seen as the kindly queen of heaven. And then here I've put for you, this is also from the textbook, where it's breaking down the different pieces of the Gothic cathedral. I would make sure you have this on hand because a lot of times during this chapter, they're going to refer to these different parts. And if you're not sure what they are, it's going to make it difficult to follow the text. Now, also in Gothic architecture, we have the addition of a triforum, and this was a new important feature. And what it is, it's a band of arcades below the clerestory. It shows a growing desire to break up all these continuous wall surfaces of the Romanesque churches. And this new horizontal zone produced the characteristic 4-story early Gothic interior elevation, the nave arcade, the tribune gallery, the triforum, and the clerestory with single lancets. And the lancets are those tall, narrow windows ending in pointed arches. So those are going to be our 4 main elements of the interior elevation. Now, probably one of the most well-known of the Gothic cathedrals is Notre Dame, and this is actually located on an island in the Seine River in Paris, France. In place of the triforum over the gallery are actually stained glass oculus, which are small round windows. And these windows filled 2 of the 4 stories in the interior. And then also, we have what's called the flying buttresses. Now, flying buttresses were first used in 1150, but here we see them in the Gothic churches used in a very large way. And the reason they did this is they used, you can see here in the picture of Notre Dame, the external buttresses. Let me go back here for a second. You can see on the chart on the right where the buttresses are, the flying buttresses, and then you can see them at Notre Dame. And what these are is the external buttresses. They come from the lower roofs over the aisles and ambulatory and counters the outward thrust of the nave vaults. So basically what happens is the interior of the building can be much more open, and then the force is pushed out through the buttresses and makes the building more stable. Now you can see here at Notre Dame, they circle the outside of the building. And so this combination of precisely positioned flying buttresses and rib vaults with pointed arches was the ideal solution to the problem of constructing these lofty naves with huge windows. And now we're going to go back to Chartres, because this is going to look at Chartres after 1194. What happened, there was actually a devastating fire there, and there was a devastating fire there, and much of it had to be rebuilt. It was rebuilt pretty quickly. It was rebuilt in 27 years, which is a relatively short time for a cathedral to be built. Now, the earlier image that we looked at right here, that is of the west facade, and that actually did survive the fire. So here we're going to look at Chartres after 1194. Historians usually consider the post-1194 Chartres Cathedral the first of what's called the High Gothic building. High Gothic dates from 1194 to 1300, and it's one of the most influential buildings in the history of architecture. And what we're going to see in it is a new kind of organization, and you can see that by the image on the right. What you're going to have is a rectangle nave bays replace the square bays. We also see a new system with a single square on the aisle that flanks a single rectangular unit in the nave. And this is going to become the norm in High Gothic. Also, you're going to see the High Gothic nave vault only had 4 parts. This was a way to unify the interior because the nave now consisted of a sequential of identical parts. And you can see here, I love this image here. You can see literally the development of the different styles. And so we are looking at Chartres, which is C. So what we see here is the incorporation of the exterior flying buttresses. Again, this enabled builders to eliminate the tribune above the aisle. And so the new High Gothic 3-story nave consisted of the arcade, the triforum, and the clerestory with greatly enlarged windows. And you can see that even going from B, Paris, to C, Chartres, you can see this drastic change. And then we're going to see it even further when we look at Amini. So again, these enlarged windows, and the Chartres windows are almost as tall as the main arcade, and they also consist of double lancets with a single crowning oculus. Now, also very important to Gothic architecture in the cathedrals is stained glass. And what happened is they would use colored glass for the windows instead of clear glass. And the goal was to transform natural light into that lux nova, the divine light. Literally, part of Suger's idea was that as that light comes through those windows and you're inside the cathedral feeling it, that sensation is to know and feel God's love. And so part of his design rests on actually his theology. Now, Gothic builders use light to transform the material works into the spiritual. The 13th century, here what we're looking at, this is the north transept's rose window from Chartres, 43 feet in diameter, and this was built in 1220. In the center, you see the enthroned Virgin and Child in the roundel at the center of the rose. They are surrounded by 4 doves of the Holy Spirit and 8 angels. The 12 square panels contain images of Old Testament kings. And then in the lancets below are St. Anne and the baby Virgin, and flanking them are 4 of Christ's Old Testament ancestors. And so you can see in these windows, they all have iconography about them, but also many of the stained glass windows in Gothic cathedrals also had narrative scenes. And so you could go to these cathedrals and be illiterate, but you could read the narrative scenes in the windows. Now, the sculptures adorning the portals of the 2 transepts are erected after 1194 are a prime example of the new High Gothic spirit. You can see here they project forcefully from the church. The jam statues on the left and on the right here, they were created between 1220 and 1230. And these are of saints in the transepts and are more independent from the architectural framework. So if we go back even right here, we can see from the original Chartres, right, the facade, to Chartres after 1194, we can see here how much they are almost separated from the columns. Now again, they are technically still attached. The example on the right is St. Theodore, circa 1230. And what's interesting in this is he's actually in the clothes. His clothing is the cloak and the chainmail armor that a 13th century crusader would wear. Also, the stance is much more natural. He's in that contrapposto, right? You can see the shifting of the weight, right? The right hip's almost stuck out a little bit. And this again reflects back to more classical works, the classical capital C style. Next, we're going to move to Amini Cathedral. This construction began in 1220 and lasted until about 1270. And you can read in the text, we do know the architect's name, so you can look at them, the three different architects. But what's important is that we did know their names. And part of this is showing the prestige they were looked at, right? That these architects of these massive cathedrals were looked at with high praise at the time. The Amini derived from the high Gothic formula of Chartres, but it's more slender, and the number and complexity of the lancet windows in both the clerestory and its triforum are greater. And you can see that by the two interior pictures we're looking at here. Here, the concept of skeletal architecture reaches its full maturity. In the naves, the highest point is 144 feet above the floor. And as we see here in the right image, when you view directly from below, the choir vaults actually resemble a canopy, like a tent-like structure that's suspended from the bundled masts. Next, we're moving on to Reims Cathedral, and this is in France's Champagne wine district. Construction here started about 1210, and this was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Since 496, this had been the site of all of the French kings' coronations. Again, we do know the architects of this building, and again, that's testifying to the prestige that these architects had. Here, the King's Gallery is above the great rose window on the facade, and you can see that on the left. Also, the figures stand taller and have more ornate frames. And basically, if we look at it, every detail of the facade seems stretched. If we take this and we go back and we look at some of the other facades, let's get a good one. Well, here we can see with Chartres, right? Take that and compare it to this one, and it's almost as if somebody stretched it, right? Somebody's pulled it up. Also, we do see the pointed arch frames over the rose window itself. And then one of the big differences here is in the tympana over the doorways, they have actually inserted stained glass windows instead of stone relief sculptures. Now, Reims is also an example of the high Gothic style in sculpture, and you can see that in the image on the right. Here we're looking at the west facade jam statues, and it shows the Annunciation in the Visitation. Now, these statues appear completely detached from their architectural background. The columns behind them are smaller too. And then this contrasts sharply with the early Gothic royal portal that we looked at. And here these works closely resemble the classical naturalistic style and feature postures in which the swaying of the hips is much more pronounced. Now, not all buildings at this time were for religious purposes. We do see the rise of secular or non-religious buildings. The prosperity of the time also brought about great construction in these secular buildings, such as town halls, palaces, and private residences. And here we're looking at two different examples. So the example on the left, this is actually a market and guild hall of the clothes makers of Bruges. The construction began in 1230, and it's located in the city's major square. Here it shows the important role of artisans and merchants in the Gothic Europe. Its design has a combination of military construction, and we do see some of that influence of ecclesiastical architecture. The example on the right is actually a private residence. This is where we're looking at the courtyard of the house of Jacques Coeur. He was a wealthy financier, and this is his townhouse in Bourges, France, built 1443 to 1451. And this is actually one of the best preserved examples of late Gothic domestic architecture. It has an irregular design with units that are arranged around an open courtyard. Now, architecture was not the only significant art of the Gothic. Book illumination and the luxury arts also, again, saw great prosperity during this time. Now, during the Gothic period, though, book production shifted from the monastic scriptoria to urban workshops of professional artists. And Paris offered the most and the best of these. And one of the examples that's talked about in the textbook are what are called moralized Bibles. These were very heavily illustrated, and each page would pair paintings of the Old and New Testament episodes with explanations of their moral significance. So that's how they got their name of moralized Bibles. Now, Bibles produced in Paris during the 1220s feature what we're looking at here on the left. This is a magnificent frontispiece. And what it's called God as Creator of the World. It's ink tempera and gold leaf on vellum. And what's so interesting about this work is we see God creating the world. However, it's not God creating the world precisely as it's described in Genesis. What we see here is it portrays God systematically creating the universe using geometrical principles, right? In fact, you can see he's creating the world with the aid of a compass. Now, geometry played an important symbolic as well as practical role in Gothic art and architecture. When Gothic architects based their designs on the art of geometry, what they were doing is they were building their forms out of abstract shapes laden with symbolic meaning, and they believed they were working according to the divinely established laws of nature. Now, the image on the right is another example of a book illumination, and some Gothic manuscript illuminators did sign their work, and this is an example of one, and he's known as Master Henri, and had a workshop located in Paris. Here, what we're looking at different Old Testament scenes involving David. Here, with the linear treatment of the hair, the figure's delicate hands and gestures, and their elegant swaying postures, these are typical of Parisian painting of the time. However, we see he's not trying to show the world again exactly as it was. He shows little concern for locating the figures in space, and he explores naturalism, but approached the book illumination as a decoration of the two-dimensional page, not as an open window into a three-dimensional world. Now, some examples of the luxury arts. What was something that was very popular at the time were statuettes of sacred figures, and these were purchased by the wealthy, and they were either purchased for private devotion in the home or as gifts to the church. An example of this is what you're going to see on the left. This is a version of Jeanne d'Arc. It was named that because it was a gift of the French queen. This is 1339, and it's silver, gilt, and enamel, and it stands 2 feet 3.5 inches tall. Now, this was donated to the Church of Saint Denis, again by the French queen. That's why it's named after her. Now, the base is decorated with enamel scenes of Christ's Passion, and here we see, the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. However, again, it reflects the style of the time. We can see this swaying posture, right? She's got that S curve to her body, the heavy drapery folds, and then the intimate human characterization of mother and son. We're not just looking at the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus, but we're looking at a moment between a mother and son. Also here on the right is an example of secular luxury art. Religious themes did monopolize the artistic production for churches in the Gothic age. However, secular themes were more prominent in a private context. Unfortunately, few of these have survived, but here's an example of this. And what we're looking at is we're actually looking at the lid of a jewelry box. And this is called the Castle of Love, and it was created between 1330 and 1350, and it's ivory and iron, 4.5 inches by 9 3/4 inches. Now, popular themes in secular art were, a lot of them were based off the stories of courtly love that were inspired by the romantic literature of the time. And so here the scene we're looking at is literally, it's the siege of the Castle of Love. And you can even see on the left-hand side, if you look in the castle, you can see the winged figure of Cupid getting ready to shoot his arrow down. All right, well, now we're going to move outside of France. And what happens is the spread of Gothic style began almost as soon as the modern style emerged in northern France. But in the second half of the 13th century, the French Gothic style became dominant throughout the continent. However, these different places usually would modify the court style according to local preferences. So what we're going to see is a merging of local Romanesque design and Gothic architecture. And we're going to explore England very briefly. The English Gothic churches are distinctly different from the French ones. The English Gothic emphasize linear pattern and horizontality instead of structural logic and verticality. So they're based more on horizontal, not the vertical. And here we're looking at Salisbury Cathedral. It was constructed 1220 to 1265, and it was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Now, the facade that you can see on the left does have some elements of the French Gothic. We see the lancet windows and blind arcades with pointed arches and statues in the shallow niches. However, height was not a defining feature, and so flying buttresses were actually used very sparingly. It has a squat screen front, and the front is actually wider than the actual building, and you can see that on the drawing in the middle. It has a long rectangular plan with double transept and a square eastern end. Now, the interior, image on the right, is Gothic with a 3-story elevation, pointed arches, and 4-part rib vaults. But the pier colonnettes stop at the springing of the nave arches, and they do not connect to the vault ribs, again making it distinct from the French Gothic. The vault ribs rise from corbels and the triforum, producing a strong horizontal emphasis. Also adding to that, you can see the dark marble that's used in the triforum moldings and corbels. And so you can see with this why it does go up instead of the vertical of the Gothic churches, the French Gothic. These seem to be focusing more on the horizontal planes. Now, the 14th century, the pier wall, and the vault elements became increasingly complex in England. This was called the decorated style, and this is the image on the left. And you can see it right here. This is the nave of the exterior cathedral. This decorated style eventually culminated in what's called the perpendicular style, and the image that you see on the right is showing this, and this is the choir of the Gloucester Cathedral. Now, the name comes from the verticality of its decorative details. However, unlike the French Gothic, where we're trying to show the structural clarity, the focus was more on the desire for decorative surfaces, basically meaning the decoration hides the structure of the church itself. All right, now we're going to move on to the Holy Roman Empire. And we're going to talk about the Moson region. And this was the region that was by the Meuse River. And this is in present-day Belgium. Now, the Moson enamels and metalworks were instrumental in the development of French Gothic figural style. You can see the gold figures stand out from a blue background, and the body twists and turns make emphatic gestures while wearing garments that almost overwhelm them with the linear patterns of the folds. And so we've seen that in the other French Gothic works. The example you're looking at here, this is Nicholas of Verdun's Sacrifice of Isaac detail from the Klostenberg altar. It was created in 1181, and it's gilded copper and enamel, and this detail is 5.5 inches. The image on the left is from Strasbourg Cathedral, which is in present-day France. It was constructed between 1176 and 1230, and the design of the building itself is mostly Romanesque. However, there are the reliefs of the two south transept portals are fully Gothic, and that's what you're looking at, one of them in the image on the left here. Again, we see the same interest in the antique style in the French works of the time. And what you're looking at is the scene from the Death of the Virgin. Here, the artist imbues the sacred figures with human emotions and wants to stir an emotional response in the observers. The Holy Roman Empire's artists carried the humanizing trend of the Gothic even further by emphasizing passionate drama. And we see that in the two images on the right. Now, this is from the Naumburg Cathedral, which is located in northern Germany. And what you're looking at is you're looking at the monumental screen that functioned as a portal to the Western choir. It includes life-size figures of Christ on the cross and the distraught Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. And again, you see that deep emotion in the work. In fact, John turns his head away and is openly crying, and Mary does not look at Christ either. And then the detail I have on the far right here, you can see the agony in Christ's face. Now, by the mid-13th century, life-size statues of secular personages also found their way into the churches and the Holy Roman Empire in England. And you can look at this in your book, but what this was, an example of that was also in the Naumburg Cathedral, and we can see it in the 12 donor statues. So these were statues made of real people and not just religious figures. But going back to the emotion that was shown in these works in the Holy Roman Empire, this we're looking at as the Rottenden Pietà. The Pietà is the moment where Mary is holding the fallen Christ. This was 1300 to 1325, and it's 2 feet 10.5 inches, and it's painted wood. This is from Rhineland, Germany. And again, it shows the interest in humanizing biblical figures in the 13th and 14th century. Here we see the suffering of Jesus and the grief of his mother. Also, we see this shift of showing the human body in motion. The Virgin is an image of maternal anguish, and the Christ figure is stunted and distorted. And it's an appalling icon of agony, death, and sorrow. And again, you're supposed to look at this and feel that emotion. Now, the architecture of the Holy Roman Empire stayed Romanesque well into the 13th century. However, by the mid-13th century, the French Gothic style began to have an influence. You can see that, the image on the left. This is at Cologne Cathedral in Cologne, Germany. Construction was started in 1248, and we can clearly see here the reflection of French Gothic. In fact, this has the choir is 150 feet tall. We also see the double lancets in the triforum, and then the tall, slender single windows in the clerestory in the choir arcade.
Sorry, could you say that again?
My phone thought I said Siri. And then the other two images, the middle and the right, this is an example, this is St. Elizabeth at Marburg, and this is an example of what's called the Hallenkirche, or the Hall Church. Now, the design is French in origin, but it developed mainly in Germany. Part of this design is the height of the aisle is the same as the nave, and you can see that in the image on the right. And also, these hall churches have no tribune, triforum, or clerestory. And again, this is the example is from St. Elizabeth at Marburg. Construction was 1235 to 1283. And here we see it incorporates the French Gothic rib vaults with pointed arches and tall lancet windows. The facade also has a 2-spire capped towers in the French manner, but there are no tracery arcades or portal sculptures. So again, we can see the French Gothic influence, but with modifications. And so that's going to conclude our exploration of these areas. And remember, this chapter is looking at a smaller section of Gothic, right? Again, Gothic mainly in France, and then England and the Holy Roman Empire.